Okay, so our topic tonight is, as Julie said, growing a fruitful landscape. And what that means is that we are going to cover a ton of different content, and we're not going to go into a huge amount of depth on any of those fronts. So you should have received sometime this week an email from the library with the handout that goes with tonight's presentation. And if you didn't, hopefully you'll get that after the presentation. If you had a chance to look at it, what you'll notice is that there are over 100 slides. And as much as I would love to stay and talk with you about fruit for like 4 hours tonight, my kids are going to appreciate if I am home in time for bedtime. And so we don't have enough time to cover all of this content. And so one of the things that I've learned from doing these presentations in the past is that a lot of folks are interested in just basic fruit information, and that's fine. But there's always some folks that were coming and really hoping to learn about elderberries or pawpaws or persimmons or mulberries or things like that. And so I'm expecting to get through about half to 2/3 of the slides tonight, and all of the slides after that are kind of extra bonus pieces of information. So if you're looking for a little bit of information on some of those less common, less familiar fruits, you can open up that handout that was emailed to you and kind of look through those later slides and see if there's some information in there. You may have to get a magnifying glass out to see it, but there are also some links to publications from either K-State or other universities that I thought were good information on those particular fruits. So that's just a little bit of information to get started with in case you're like, well, I was waiting for this particular fruit. Hopefully you'll at least get some information. So what my goal is tonight is to talk a little bit about how we put fruit into our urban landscape. And so most of us, not all of us, I'm sure some of you have larger acreages or more space to plant fruit, but most of us are probably dealing with a traditional urban lot type size and trying to figure out how to put fruiting plants into that space. And so that is one part of what we're going to talk about tonight, is thinking about how to use fruit thoughtfully in an urban landscape, and some tips and tricks and ideas on types of fruit that might work in different circumstances. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to give you just enough information about several different types of fruit for you to be dangerous. So I'm hopefully going to give you enough information to get you started and direct you to some resources if there's a particular fruit that you really want to know more about. So we're going to cover some very basic landscaping things. We're going to cover some very basic fruit science, growing fruit type things. And then if we have time, of course, I'm happy to take questions at the end. So as we go, I do know that especially when we start dealing with fruit, sometimes there's terminology or vocabulary that is foreign or a little bit different from what we're used to. So if you have a question that's like, what in the world do you mean when you say self-fertile? Like, feel free to pop that in the chat so that I can answer it, because you're probably not the only one wondering that. Other questions, if you're looking for specific recommendations on certain things, you can always pop those questions in the chat when you think of them, but I'll probably wait to answer them until either a natural pause point or the end, depending on how our time is progressing. So with that, let's jump in a little bit and think about why are we even here? Why are we talking about having a fruitful landscape? And turning that around a little bit, why are we even considering landscaping with fruiting plants? And so there's several reasons that we could consider for that. One of them is fruiting plants do have some ornamental value. So we just here in the last week or so finished up the nasty ornamental pear season, so all of those nasty flowers are gone. And the great thing with our fruiting trees is that you still have that ornamental value and you get something worthwhile out of them as well, unlike our ornamental pears, which smell nasty. And anyway, I'm not going to get too much on my soapbox about the ornamental pears, but why not grow something that has fruit on it? Putting fruit into your garden and into your landscape it's not always going to be the case. So, there's always exceptions and caveats, but can give you a relatively inexpensive source of fruit, and definitely a larger volume of fruit than you might be used to in other circumstances, especially when you start looking at tree fruit. If you are an avid gardener or excited by the idea of gardening, growing fruit is a gardening challenge. It is definitely another level of gardening from vegetable gardening. Vegetables and herbs, a lot of them are annuals. They're fairly forgiving, or if something goes horrendously wrong, like you can replant next year without too much expense. And so when you're looking at fruit are perennial plants, and they are a challenge to grow in Kansas. We're going to spend a good bit of the first part of our presentation telling you all the things that make it difficult to grow fruit in Kansas. So I hopefully will not scare all of you off. When I was doing in person on Tuesday night, I was pleased that no one ran away after the first part of the presentation. But of course on Zoom, it's a lot easier for you to sneak out of the room without me noticing if I scare you off too much. So do bear with us because growing fruit can be a challenge for us in Kansas, but it's a very rewarding challenge. There's nothing quite like having fresh fruit from your own yard to enjoy. And then the last reason that I like growing fruit in a home landscape is that we get to grow different things. We don't have to grow the basic things we see in the grocery store. When's the last time you saw a red currant in the grocery store? My guess is probably never. Or if you saw a red currant in the grocery store, it was in the form of jelly and probably a very expensive price for a small jar or something like that. Maybe dried currants, but you probably did not see a fresh red currant. So if you want to have fresh red currants, you're probably going to have to grow it yourself. Or if you want different varieties of apples or peaches, you may have to grow them yourself. So all of those are great reasons to consider having fruit in our landscape. So when we start thinking about our urban lots, our landscape spaces, one of the things that is a real barrier for a lot of folks is they are thinking about, either what they've seen on fruit farms or maybe older trees that they remember from when they're growing up. So they're thinking about large trees that take up lots of space. And one of the things, that I'm going to challenge you to do is, instead of thinking about a huge tree that's going to take a ton of space, what are some options for putting trees in smaller spaces? So we're going to talk about different tree sizes and shapes, way to prune them, way to train them to fit better in a smaller landscape. So in this slide, you can see the larger peach tree, and then in the bottom right-hand corner are some apple trees that are pruned using a method called Espalier. And we're going to talk more about Espalier here several slides from now. But this is a much higher maintenance type of method and pruning technique using highly dwarfed trees. But as you can see, it takes up significantly less space, and you still get a pretty significant crop of apples on them. And the same thing holds true when we start thinking about our berries. We maybe have this picture in our mind from going to a U-Pick berry farm, or pictures that we've seen, where you have big long rows of berries and very utilitarian trellises, with lots of ugly T-posts and things like that. It's not very eye-catching. It's not like, I don't want this in the middle of my yard. It's not attractive. That's not what I want my yard to look like. So we're going to think about with our berries, how can we use them in our landscape in a way that fits with our overall look and feel. And sometimes, to be perfectly honest, that does mean that we sacrifice a little bit of our total yield. We can't always, have all the things that we want, of course. And so we may have to compromise a little bit on certain aspects of our landscape to incorporate fruit, and we may have to compromise a little bit on some aspects of our fruit production in order to have the landscape that we want. But as you can see in this picture, you can have berries, and in this situation, they're using them as a border kind of along a driveway, between a fence and a driveway. So all kinds of places that fruit can be incorporated into a landscape in some way other than just making a row with ugly trellises and things like that. So before we go any further, we want to think a little bit about what fruit can we grow in Kansas. And so there's a wide range of things that we can grow. On our tree fruit side, apples, pears, and peaches are probably the most common. Cherries and plums have some options as well. And then on our small fruit, our more berries, we have strawberries, blackberries that grow very well here, raspberries that in most cases do quite well here. Grapes can do pretty well here. And then, of course, everyone always wants to grow blueberries. So I have it on this slide with a question mark because it's so popular and everyone wants to grow them. But blueberries are extremely difficult to grow here in Kansas. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. I actually did put blueberries off on my post presentation slides because I didn't want to spend too much time on them, but we will touch on why they're a challenge in Kansas here a little bit later. And then currants and gooseberries can also both be grown in Kansas. They are also a little bit more marginal, partly because they're more native to Northern Europe, and Northern Europe tends to be a little more mild, particularly summer temperatures than we are here. So they definitely are options here. We do have some native currants and gooseberries, but a lot of the high quality fruit producing ones can be a little bit challenging here in Kansas. And then we've got a whole bunch of other less common fruit options. So if you are interested in having edibles just for the sake of having edibles or doing something kind of out there a little bit less familiar, these are all some options that you can take a look at. Pawpaw has become much more popular in the last decade or so as a native fruit for the US. And so pawpaw does grow here fairly well. There's always questions about citrus. And of course, citrus we can't grow outdoors, but there are options for growing it in containers and things like that. And then some other tree fruits, apricots, quince, persimmons, and then a whole bunch of kind of unique shrubs and vines that do produce edible things: elderberry, aronia, hardy kiwi, passion flower, so on and so forth. So all of these different things that do produce edible fruits in one shape or form. Of course, mulberry. I always debate, do I put mulberry on? Because yeah, it's technically a fruit and it's a very very well adapted fruit. It's kind of naturalized here in Kansas, for better or for worse. But then I'm also well, but it's kind of a weed. At least in my neighborhood, mulberry is a weed. I feel like mulberry seedlings are one of the biggest weeds that I have to dig out of my blackberry patch on a regular basis. So all of these, we're not going to go into great detail on any of these fruit options tonight, but at least some of them I've included in the end part of the slide set. So our next step is getting ourselves prepared to grow fruit. So even before we get into the details of what and how to do the different fruits, I want to talk to you about what you need to do to be ready to be a good fruit gardener. And the first thing, you're already here tonight, so you're off on the right track, but that is to really research and understand the requirements and growth cycle of the particular fruit that you want to have. Unlike vegetables that are annual plants, you grow them. If something goes wrong, you try again next year. With our fruit, because they're perennials and they have certain growth cycles, they have certain requirements, it's really important, to do some research and understand what's going to be needed to have a successful crop of any particular fruit. One of the things, and I think all of us are susceptible to it, even those of us that are well educated, I can't stop myself when I'm going into the grocery store and they've got like the stack of fruit trees sitting there by the entrance. Like I have to stop and look at them because it's like, it's a fruit tree, it's there, like maybe I can buy it and have something cool. Even though in my head, I know, like, just don't do that. So we tend to fall prey to the fruit plant that looks sad and lonely and is on sale for a really low price at the box store at the end of the spring planting season. Like, oh, I can totally buy this thing and stick it in my yard and it'll be great. So we have this tendency to do that. All of us do, for sure. And we tend to get really excited about the idea of the fruit without understanding what it needs to be successful. So to the best of your ability, you want to make an informed purchase from a reputable source after researching your requirements and your growth cycle. One of the things that I think would be the saddest. So for instance, Tart cherries tend to fruit every year about Memorial Day. Well, if you every single year travel at Memorial Day, for a week right around Memorial Day, and you miss your cherry crop every single year, like, well, that's kind of like, why did you even plant a cherry? Because you're never going to get the fruit. The birds are going to get it every single year, unless, excuse me, unless you have a neighbor or something that can come and rescue your cherries for you. So just thinking about all of those things with your perennials. We are also going to spend a fair bit of time talking about pollination, what pollination is and what pollination needs are for especially our tree fruits. But it's important to know with fruit production that some varieties, some types of fruit are going to need cross-pollination. And we'll define cross-pollination and all of that here in a couple more slides. But again, buying a fruit plant that needs another variety for it to even set fruit at all is an important piece of information to know. And then the next piece of information is to research the best varieties for your conditions. And again, make that informed purchase from a reputable source. Most of the times, like these box stores that are getting fruit in, they're getting things with name brand value. So they're going to have like Honeycrisp apples or Gala apples or Jonathan apples. They're going to have things that people recognize the names of from the grocery store. And they're not necessarily going to be the best adapted choices for our conditions in Kansas. A lot of fruit really don't care for our Kansas weather conditions. And so it's important that we do a good job researching and understanding what is likely to be the most successful. So kind of along that line, we also want to research possible insect and disease problems for whatever the fruit that you're going to be looking at, and those treatment options. And this might seem like a bit excessive to do before you buy a fruit plant, but you kind of want to know what you're getting yourself into and what your expectations are. If your expectation is to have a fruit that looks like you could buy it in the grocery store, then you kind of need to understand in advance what that level of maintenance means and what that looks like. And by the same token, if you have a strong preference to use like organic production methods, organic pest management treatment options, then you want to know what are those options. Are there things that I like physically have time to do from a labor standpoint, or am physically able to do with a particular plant, and Or if I can't do those things, do I know what my likely outcome is going to be? And are you okay with that? Are you okay with a certain percentage of your apples having caterpillars in them? If you are, that's great. If you don't have any tolerance for caterpillars in your apples, then you may want to make a different choice. So understanding what the challenges are, what you're going to do in advance. Just hoping that you're not going to have an issue is not a good plan in Kansas, from my experience. At some point, everything is going to have a challenge of one sort or another. You also do want to be aware that birds are big fans of fruit plants. They're big fans of fruit. And in some cases, gardeners are like, oh, that's okay. The birds, they get their share, I get some, it's all okay. But in other cases, you may want to have a plan for using bird netting and things like that to keep the birds away from your fruit crop. And then to be really honest, to also be okay with the fact that occasionally you will have a dead bird in the bird netting to deal with, if that's the decision that you make. So the last thing from a preparing yourself to grow fruit standpoint is just this understanding that growing fruit in Kansas is a challenge. Our weather extremes can be challenging. They can be hard on the fruit. And the maintenance can be a challenge with some of the insects and diseases. And so we want to go into it expecting a certain amount of quality loss, that most of the time what we harvest is not going to look like what we get from the grocery store. And we need to be okay with that. So just, again, I hate to start out being all doom and gloom about growing fruit, but I think if you start with a reasonable expectation, you're going to be a lot more pleased with your end result. So one more slide. I've mentioned a couple times about the challenges of growing fruit in Kansas, and I do want to call out some specific challenges that we do experience. So some of our fruits are not as cold hardy as others. So our cold temperatures in the winter can be problematic. For example, on those random, like once every 7 to 10 years, when we get over winter temperatures that are below 15 below zero. So not very often that happens, but every so often it does. Temperatures below about 15 below zero can cause fruit buds to be killed on peach trees and things like that. So that is going to cause us to lose some or all of our crop in that particular winter. So winter cold temperatures, there's also especially some of those strange things like persimmons, and even less strange things like blackberries. There's certain varieties that are only hardy to zone 7. And we here in South Central Kansas are hardy, we are zone 6. And so certain varieties won't perform as well for us because it gets too cold in the winter. We also, of course, tend to have spring frosts. Just earlier this week, we had a morning temperature of 32 degrees, and I wasn't expecting it. I looked at my phone and on Tuesday, I think it was Tuesday morning, and went, really? It's 32? What? It's not supposed to be doing that now. But it's one of the things that, especially if you're growing fruit, you kind of learn to keep an eye on and understand that those things happen, and that does cause us to lose a fruit crop every so often. So peaches, for example, it's pretty common to only have a crop 2 or 3 out of every 5 years because of our spring frosts. Summer heat can be a challenge. Some of our fruits do not like heat. So some don't like cold, some don't like heat. We're kind of right in the middle, so we get the worst of both worlds on that front. And so like raspberries and currants and gooseberries, they don't always appreciate the heat of our summer. And so the plants can scorch and it can be a challenge to keep them alive, or the fruit can get sunburned and not be as good a quality. So all of those things can be a struggle. And then we have extreme wet, we have extreme cold, we have heavy soils, and sometimes it rains a lot. All of these extremes that go back and forth are really, really hard on our fruit plants. The next thing that is a challenge in Kansas is that most fruit plants prefer acidic soils. They prefer soils with a pH of about 5.5 to 6.5, and most of our Kansas soils are naturally occurring pHs about 7.2 to 7.5. So we tend to have more alkaline soils than most fruit prefer. This is also the point where I'm going to talk about blueberries really briefly. So blueberries are an exception, but not the right direction. Blueberries need highly acidic soil. They need soil pH of about 4.5 to 5.2, which is very acidic. And I will apologize in advance to anyone that is not a math person. So if you're a math person, you can be excited for a minute, but the pH scale is a logarithmic scale. So like 4.5 isn't twice as acidic as 5.5. It's actually 10 times as acidic. And 4.5 isn't 3 times or 4 times as acidic as 6.5. It's actually 100 times more acidic than 6.5. So the more alkaline we get, the harder it is to get down to that preferred pH for blueberries. So most of the time, if you're going to have success with blueberries in Kansas, you are either building a raised bed that you're filling the soil completely or using containers or things like that. So we actually just added a raised bed with sphagnum peat moss designed for growing blueberries in our demonstration garden this last fall. And we've got some plants growing in it. So we'll see how we do with it. It's kind of a new endeavor for us to have those blueberries in the garden and work with them. But feel free to come and take a look at them if you happen to be up this direction. So that's the challenge with our blueberries. And again, all of our fruits prefer slightly acidic soil, but blueberries are really picky about their soil. Also, most of our fruits prefer well-drained soil, meaning they don't like the soil to be really wet and standing in water. And so if you have a spot in your yard that water tends to stand, that is not a good choice for a spot for fruit. And if you've got that heavy clay soil, one of the things you may want to think about before planting one of these perennial fruit plants is building a raised bed, either like a more traditional raised bed with the boxed edges, or even just a berm, so kind of a gently sloped hill that can give you a little bit better drainage with that heavy soil. And so we have all of these crazy weather things and environmental things going on. And then we have diseases that are caused or exacerbated by these weather extremes and or soil conditions. So all of these challenges for growing fruit in Kansas. So I'm impressed no one's left, or if anyone's left, more people have joined. So good job on sticking with it. But again, just that reminder that we want to start from this place of managing our expectations about growing fruit. So a few more introductory things. We've hit on the soil quite a bit already as far as the requirements. I will also say that fruit plants do need full sun. And we define full sun as at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight. So it doesn't mean it has to be in the middle of your yard where it's getting sun every second of the day, but it needs to be in a spot that's going to get at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight. And you can cheat that a little bit and give things a little less sun, but you are going to compromise your total yield and fruit production. So the less sun that your fruit plants get, the less they're going to produce. And then last but not least is water. And it seems pretty obvious. Fruits themselves are usually 95 to 98% water. And so we just want to be sure that when we're incorporating fruit plants into our gardens and into our landscapes, we put them in a spot where it's easy to get them the water that they need. To get good quality fruit, you need to water those plants regularly. And to mitigate some of the stress of the weather conditions, we also need to be watering regularly. Okay, a couple more overview slides with our fruit. And just to kind of help you frame and think through what might be a good fit for your situation. So this chart talks about the relative pest pressure or pest problems that we see with different types of fruit. And so you can see like nectarines and Japanese plums and sweet cherries are very high on the pest control needs. And then peaches and grapes are listed as high. So I definitely agree that peaches can have some pest challenges to deal with. Grapes, you know, I kind of go back and forth on this one because my experience with grapes is, especially like table grapes, if you're just growing grapes to eat fresh, sometimes like if you start having disease or insect pressure, it just kind of builds up and gets worse. But you can also go for quite a while without having any major issues with your grapes. So, you know, it can either be pretty bad or not so bad at all. So just a little bit of a caveat with the grapes there. Most of our fruits kind of fall into this medium category, you know, where they can have some things, but they're not too terribly difficult to deal with if we have a plan or looking for resistant varieties and things like that. And then on the low end, currants, blueberries, pears, and mulberries. Mulberries, it's just, you know, they're a weed, right? Nothing's going to kill them. So not a whole lot of pest control issues on the mulberries. Pears are fairly low maintenance as well. And then currants and blueberries, a lot of that is just, there's not very many of them here because we don't have the right conditions. And so we don't tend to see very many pest challenges. Another thing to think about are pruning needs, as far as the amount of labor and time that you need to spend pruning, as well as like how big of a deal it is if you don't do the pruning. And so on the very high end for pruning needs are blackberries and raspberries and grapes. And blackberries and raspberries are on this end of the spectrum because, and I'm gonna start throwing out some of our sciencey words here. Blackberries and raspberries are perennial plants, but the canes themselves are biennial, which means they only live for 2 years. And so at the end of that second year, they die and they have to be pruned out. So if you don't keep on pruning as needed with our blackberries and raspberries, you can end up with this really nasty bramble thicket that no one knows what to do with pretty quickly. So regular pruning is very key to having a decent patch of blackberries or raspberries. And then grapes are also a big challenge for the home gardener on the pruning front, not because it's too terribly difficult to do, but because there's so much pruning that it just freaks everyone out if they've never done it before. So grapes, and we'll look at a couple slides when we get to the grapes that will hopefully help you see what this looks like a little better. But you prune off 90% of the canes of the growth every single year with a grapevine. And so that can be really intimidating for a new fruit gardener. On the high side, peaches, sweet cherries are both high pruning needs, and that again is they produce fruit. Grapes do this as well on their 1-year-old wood. And so you have to be pruning consistently to make sure that you always have 1-year-old wood that's going to be producing fruit. Strawberries, you may be sitting there going like, why are the strawberries on the high pruning list? You know, they're this little plant, right? Like, what are you doing? You're crazy. And the reason that they're up there is because strawberries will put on all these runners and make a really thick patch. They'll become so thick that they are weeds unto themselves, and they reduce their yield when the plant patch is too thick. And so we actually recommend a process called renovation for strawberries, where you till up 2/3 of your planting every single year to let it kind of regrow and reestablish and renovate or refresh the planting so that you continually get a good crop. So that is why strawberries are listed as a high pruning need. So higher maintenance things, medium pruning, apples, plums, blueberries, currants, gooseberries have kind of a more moderate level of pruning required. And then on the low end, pears, European plums, tart cherries, and mulberries don't need a whole lot of pruning, especially compared to some of our others. You know, I have a tart cherry tree at home. I've had it for about 5 years now, and it's about 5 feet tall. And when I get ready to go out and prune, you know, I go and I take a look at it and I'm like, okay, clip, you're fine. You know, no big deal. Not a whole lot that needs to be pruned. Whereas my peach tree is an out of control monster. And I look at it and go, okay, I need the tall ladder and the pole pruner and, you know, the pole chainsaw and my husband with the long arms. And full confession, my peach tree has still not gotten pruned this year because life and all of the things. So I'm going to have to do some pruning this summer, because otherwise it's going to be a completely out of control beast. But you know, very different pruning requirements between those two types of trees. The last thing before we switch gears a little bit is some guidelines and considerations when you are choosing varieties. And of course, every type of fruit is going to have some more specific things to look for. But when we're thinking about choosing varieties, these are things that you should look for. You know, we're talking about having a fruitful landscape. So of course, we want to consider the mature size of the plant and what is going to fit in your landscape, what is an acceptable amount of space to use and what is not. So be really honest with yourself about the mature size of the particular fruit plant that you're going to be planting. Hardiness zone, we've mentioned that already as far as how cold tolerant it is. So you want to look at the cold tolerance with the hardiness zone. And then again, the heat tolerance. With most of our fruiting plants, if you see a variety that is touting its heat tolerance or its ability to produce fruit during hot weather or hot conditions, or have good quality fruit during hot weather, it's, in my opinion, it's at least worth a try. It's at least worth giving that a shot or doing further research to see and make sure that other factors are going to work for you, because heat tolerance is such a deal here for our fruit. Disease resistance is really important, especially for those of you wanting organic production practices. Disease resistance, looking for genetic disease resistance, is one of the best ways to be able to grow fruit organically without needing a whole lot of pesticides. So keep that in mind, both like foliar disease resistance, also root rot resistance, and things like that. And then of course, we're not growing fruit if we're not growing something we want to eat. So we want to keep in mind the fruit qualities that we prefer, flavor, firmness, fruit size, what types of uses we want for our particular fruit. You know, are you wanting to grow apples to brew your own cider? Are you wanting to grow apples for fresh eating or things like that? So all of those things come into our considerations in variety selection. Okay, I'm gonna talk a little bit about some science here. I'm gonna start with some third grade science of pollination. My daughter's class is working on seed producing plants right now, so that fits right in. And so fruiting plants, like basic plant science, for a plant to produce a fruit, it has to have a flower that is pollinated. And so when we talk about pollination, what we are talking about is the anthers, or the male part of the flower that produce pollen. The pollen is then being placed on the stigma, or the female part of the flower. And that is then going to move, the pollen is going to go down into the ovary, and the seeds will develop, and the fruit around the seeds are going to develop due to that pollination. And so that is kind of the basic. When we talk about pollination, that is what we are talking about. And so with our fruit plants, then where it becomes particularly important to understand what's happening is that some plants will not accept their own pollen. So if you have 2 Honeycrisp apple trees, the bees can go to town as much as they want to, moving pollen around, but the Honeycrisp apple tree will not pollinate. It will not develop a fruit from its own pollen. It has to have pollen from a genetically different variety. So this is called being self-sterile. So that is a situation where a particular fruit will not set fruit unless it is pollinated by the pollen of a genetically different variety. So it still has to be the same species, right? It has to be an apple. But as you can see, like in this diagram, I need to have a Honeycrisp apple and a Gala apple. And then the bee will move the pollen from the Gala apple to the Honeycrisp and the Honeycrisp to the Gala, and they will happily set fruit. Now there's always a question at this point about like, well, but then aren't the fruit gonna be like mixed? Like, how does that work? And so this is one reason that we don't plant seeds from apples at the grocery store, because they have to be cross-pollinated. And so when they're cross-pollinated, the seeds inside the apple are genetically a combination of the two varieties. So you're not, if you plant seeds out of a Honeycrisp apple, you're not going to get a Honeycrisp apple. You're going to get a Honeycrisp crossed with whatever it was whatever it was pollinated by, and who knows if it's something that you actually want to have. But the fruit itself is still going to genetically be like the parent plant. So that's kind of how that works. So certain fruits, again, are self-sterile, where you need two different varieties. So now I've complicated things, right? Instead of, oh, I'm just going to plant an apple tree in my space in my yard. Now I have to have two apple trees to get the fruit set that I want to have. On the flip side, we have other fruits that are what we call self-fertile. And so self-fertile trees do not need a second variety. They will set fruit with pollen from themselves. So peaches are a good example of this. You can just have one peach tree, and the bees will happily buzz around and pollinate it, and it will set fruit with just itself. So that is also an important piece of information to know when you're deciding what to plant. So this next slide looks, this is a chart of some of our basic fruit trees. And if you're looking at some of those less common things, I do have that information on those slides towards the end of the handout. So apples and pears are almost always self-sterile. Apples are always self-sterile. Pears, there's a very small asterisk. There's a couple partially self-fertile varieties, but mostly they're self-sterile. And then peaches and nectarines, tart cherries, and European plums are self-fertile, meaning you only need one variety. Sweet cherries and Japanese plums are self-sterile in most cases, meaning, again, you need two varieties to get fruit set. So anymore, there's always some exceptions. So it's really important to do a little bit of research and also make sure that what you're purchasing will cross-pollinate itself, or whatever variety that you're hoping to cross-pollinate. Now, I will tell you that crab apples are the same species as fruiting apples. And so if you already have a crabapple tree or your neighbor has a crabapple tree, you can plant an apple tree and still get fruit set. They will cross-pollinate. So that is kind of a happy bonus, because there are generally quite a few ornamental crabapples around most neighborhoods. On the flip side, though, with our pears, those nasty, stinking ornamental pears do not pollinate fruiting pears. So they have no value whatsoever, except they look pretty when you're far enough away, you don't have to smell them. And so ornamental pears bloom really early and fruiting pears bloom late. And so it's very rare for them to overlap in a way that they can cross-pollinate each other. So anyway, that's a little bit of detail on those fruit tree pollinations. Most of our berries, like strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, are all self-fertile. They don't need to be cross-pollinated, which is pretty handy. Okay, switching gears again to talk a little bit about ways we can incorporate fruit trees into our landscape. So when we think about fruit trees, we often think about this, right? This picture where it's an orchard, you know, you've got all these rows, and these are pretty moderate sized trees, but like, you know, they're going to get big and need a ladder and all these sorts of things. And so, of course, fruit trees can play that role in your landscape. If you're starting with a fairly open landscape, you could definitely go with a larger size fruit tree, you know, and get some of that flowering goodness with something that's also going to produce fruit instead of just the flowers for a period in the spring. But we can also look with our fruit trees and look at dwarf varieties. Particularly apples have a ton of options, but anymore there's genetic dwarf peaches that don't get more than about 5-6 feet tall. There's lots of options for more dwarf trees. And if you're in a situation where you have to use containers, you can also grow some fruit trees in containers as well, and kind of help keep them smaller that way. It's not easy to do, but it is definitely possible. I will also call your attention to this picture here on the right. This is on a commercial orchard scale, we'd call this like a high density planting, and it's become very popular for commercial orchards because you get fruit earlier and you put lots of trees in the space and so on and so forth. But this is something that can also be done in a home garden situation. So you can see these trees are significantly closer together, and there's definitely more pruning work to be done. But so they've got kind of a trellis situation going, and they're pruning the fruit trees heavily to keep them in that space. So lots of options that we can do for fruit trees in the landscape. I did say I'd talk a little bit more about the Espalier, and so a couple different pruning methods here, visual looks here. Often Espalier is done on a fence or a trellis or along a wall or something like that. And the tree is pruned, it's obviously still 3D, but not in a big circle. The tree is usually pruned to be fairly flat. So you can see a couple different things here on this next slide. Also, you can see a little bit better what that pruning, what that tree looks like in the dormant season when it's not fully leafed out. So you can see that there's a lot of pruning work that goes into this. Some of these diagrams, there's all kinds of different techniques that you can try to prune your plants into. For beginners, starting with the more basic one, like you see in these pictures, is probably better than getting all fancy like the drawings. So this technique has been around for hundreds of years, very common and popular in Europe, especially older European gardens, and definitely takes some time and experience and things like that. Again, full disclosure, my original plan with my peach tree was to espalier it. And the peach tree kind of had a mind of its own. It was like, no, I'm going to grow a whole lot more than you wanted me to. But even for a beginner, like apples and pears are a little easier to do with the espalier, or tart cherries can be a little easier than some of the more vigorous types of species. There are also starting to be some more diversity in tree shapes and things like that. There have been some columnar apple trees developed in recent years, which are kind of fun options as well. And I've got a slide about them here when we get to the apples. And then just overall, being aware of different types of tree sizes. There are trees that are grafted onto dwarfing rootstocks. And if that sounds like utter gibberish, we will get to that on the next slide. But you can look for trees that are quite a bit more dwarf than others. So the last kind of basic fruit tree science thing I want to touch on briefly is the concept of grafting. Most of our fruit trees are grafted. And that means that the cultivar that you want to have, that has the fruit characteristics that you want to have, is the scion. And that part is they take a cutting of a branch and then they fuse it to a different rootstock. And usually the rootstock, it's still like you have to graft an apple onto an apple and things like that. But the rootstock has usually been bred and selected for certain characteristics. So it might have dwarfing characteristics where it keeps the tree from, instead of being 30 feet tall, it's only 10 feet tall. It may have better resistance to alkaline soil conditions or wet soil conditions, heavy soils. Might have more cold tolerance or disease resistance or insect resistance, all of these different things that a rootstock can have that will benefit that scion, that preferred cultivar that it's grafted onto. So almost all fruit trees are grafted, and we generally recommend that you choose a grafted fruit tree if for no other reason than that growing fruit from seed, like from a seedling, it usually takes about 30 years to get ripe fruit the first harvest, and grafting, usually you get your fruit harvest in 2 to 7 years, depending on the type of fruit. So grafting is always beneficial, but also it can be really helpful for us in Kansas to look for rootstocks that give us better adaptability, particularly to our soil conditions or to the landscape needs, the size of the plant that we need. So then that always begs the question, what about fruit salad trees? What about these 4-in-1 or 3-in-1 or whatever, however many in one trees? Are they a good choice? Can't I do that because like all these pollination things, like why don't I do this instead, and so on and so forth. And so what I would say about these multi-grafted trees or fruit salad trees is you have to be a smart shopper. You can't just buy the thing that looks the flashiest and has the prettiest marketing. So the first key is, if they're telling you that a tree has apples and pears and peaches and cherries, like it has all kinds of different types of fruit, then it's most likely a scam or it's not going to work for you, because the way the grafting works, you can't have multiple species on one tree. That's just not how it works. So if you see something that's like, oh, 2 or 3 or 4 types of apples on one tree, that's generally more likely to be successful, or 2 or 3 or 4 types of pears, or 2 or 3 or 4 types of peaches. That's more likely to be successful. There can still be challenges because they might be different vigor levels for growth and make pruning a little bit tricky, or they ripen at different times, so it makes pest control a little bit tricky. But you're going to have more success with those types of multi-grafted trees. I will say, so you can see this picture here, it's got nectarines, plums, apricots, and peaches. And so all 4 of those are technically Prunus species. Their genus is Prunus, and they're different. They have a different specific epithet. So they're different species, but they're like first cousins. And so because of the way the genetics work and the way the grafting and rootstocks work, it is technically possible to do this, to do nectarines, plums, apricots, and peaches all in one tree. I still would recommend against it. I don't think it's very likely to be successful, especially here in Kansas, because there's so many challenges with these fruit in Kansas anyway. But technically it could work, but I still think it's not necessarily a good choice. One last, I feel like every one of these slides is a mini soapbox. So one last mini soapbox before we jump into some specific fruits. And that is pruning and thinning fruit trees. We've talked about pruning a little bit already, and pruning is really critical with our fruits in order to consistently have production year after year after year. And I do not have, unfortunately, I do not have time to go into all of the things on pruning this year. Or this presentation, but I will throw a couple of publications into the chat on our different fruit pruning publications. So if you need to know or want to know more about pruning fruit trees, you can check out either of those publications that I just dropped into the chat box. So feel free to take a look at those later on. The other thing, though, is the thinning. And this, it's almost as bad as like pruning grapevines or renovating strawberries for hard things that new fruit growers really struggle with, and that is thinning the fruit. So our apples and peaches in particular, although pears can do this as well, they tend to overset. They set more fruit than the tree can ripen successfully. And we can really see a hard time with that in Kansas because we have these winter weather or spring frosts where we lose a crop every so often, and then the tree wants to compensate in the following year and has a huge crop. And we hate, because we lost a crop, we want to have as much fruit as we can, and so we don't want to thin off the extra fruit. But fruit thinning is really important to having good quality fruit. Generally with apples, we recommend 1 fruit for every 4 inches of branch. And for peaches, we recommend 1 fruit for every approximately 6 inches of branch. And so certain varieties, or if we didn't have a crop the previous year, they will go crazy and you'll have so much fruit and then you have to thin a good chunk of it off so that you still get good sized fruit. I know I've had folks that I've counseled that they need to thin their fruit and they're like, oh, I can't do it. I really want my fruit. And then they'll come back later and say, okay, you were right. I should have thinned my fruit off because my peaches were, the size of a $50 and 30 or 3/4 of them were pits and there was nothing there. Or, my branches broke because the fruit was so heavy on the tree. So really important to do thinning of your fruit on your apples and pears and peaches in particular. Okay, let's get into some specific fruits, which is probably why you're here tonight anyway. And we've spent a whole hour talking about the basics of fruit before we got into that. So with our apples, apple varieties, there's thousands of apple varieties, and even just from an amusement value, I love this orangepippin.com website because it has listings for hundreds and hundreds of different varieties, and you can look up and learn a little bit about them and their genetics and things like that. So when you're looking at apple varieties, you want to think about the flavor and your intended use for your apple. You want to think about ripening time because apples can ripen anywhere from July through October in Kansas. So you want to know, what your ripening window is likely to be. Of course, pollination is really critical. Most apples will pollinate each other, but there's a few things that will not. So it's important to do some research. Some apples store really well, like they'll last a long time in storage, and others need to be eaten right away when they're fresh. And then disease resistance. I really should put that like at the top in like flashing letters or something. Apples have a couple of diseases: apple scab, cedar apple rust, and then fire blight, which can be extremely problematic in Kansas. And so we really encourage you to look for disease-resistant varieties. So this is not a comprehensive list. There's a few things that aren't on here that could be, but these are some examples of disease-resistant apple varieties. And what you probably noticed looking at this slide is you don't see any of the things that you see in the grocery store. There's no Jonathan, there's no Gala, there's no Macintosh, there's no Honeycrisp. All of the things that we see in the grocery store for apple varieties are not very disease resistant. And so that can be a little bit of a challenge because like we have an affinity for those things. Like we want something that's familiar, but I'd encourage you to look into some of these disease resistant cultivars. Some of them have similar characteristics to those apples that you already know and love, but they're more resistant to these problematic diseases. I did promise the slide on columnar apples. There's several varieties of columnar apples out there that are going to be that much more upright growth habit. They're fairly new, the urban apple series. There's 4 varieties, and then there's these other Sentinel and North Pole varieties as well. that have been around for a little bit longer. I do have a couple of columnar apple trees in my yard, and they are very well behaved. I hardly prune them at all. They have a really nice shape, so really kind of enjoy them. I didn't mention it earlier, but I will say, like, growing fruit is a little bit of an adventure. Every year, you never quite know what to expect. And so I don't know if my apple trees are just like alternate biennial bearing right now, but I have these two columnar apples that are different varieties. And the one is just sitting there with no blossoms on it, and the other one is completely covered with blossoms. So luckily my neighbors have crab apples because they're clearly not doing their pollination gig at the moment. And I'm just like, why? I have no idea. I don't know why the one has flowers and the other one does not. So every year growing fruit is a new adventure. I've got apples, I have a grapevine, I have blackberries, strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, my peach and cherry tree I've mentioned already. I planted a couple currants last year. And every year is a new adventure. I never know, even though it's my job, I never know in a given year which fruit is going to cover me up and which fruit is inexplicably going to have nothing, or very little, or have a disease or insect issue that is a pain. So always a new adventure with fruit. So those are the columnar apple varieties you might take a look at. On the pear side of things, pears are pretty well adapted to Kansas in a lot of cases, and we can grow both on the left side here, European pears, which we're a little more familiar with, seen in the grocery store, but we can also grow Asian pears. So Asian pears are round like an apple, they're crunchy like an apple, they have kind of a floral pear flavor, a more mild flavor, I think, than European pears. So kind of fun, and they are pretty well adapted to our environment as well. The biggest challenge with our European pears, with pears in general, is fire blight. This is a bacterial disease that some years is not a problem at all. This is a pretty dry spring, and so I'd be surprised if we see much fire blight unless we get a really rainy spell. But in a year when we have bad fire blight, it's really bad. Like it can kill a whole tree if it gets that bad. And so we prefer to look for fire blight resistant varieties. So of course, you can see the names that you probably are familiar with, like Bartlett and Anjou and Bosque. Concord and Comici aren't as common in this area in the grocery store, but I've seen them in other places. And all of them are very susceptible to fire blight. Of course, like the thing that we recognize is not the good choice here. So there's some good fire blight resistant varieties listed there. And then I've also listed some of the partially self-fertile. So they're not going to set a full crop without cross-pollination, but they will set at least some fruit with no cross-pollination. And so some of the common things, of course, and then a couple of the things that are more fire blight resistant also. With our Asian pears, again, they're well adapted to our climate, but we really want to look for those fire blight resistant varieties. They are milder and less sweet than European pears. So it's something a little bit different that you might take a look at. The other caveat with pears in general, and especially Asian pears, is you really want to do a good job on researching your pollination because they don't produce as much pollen. They're harder to pollinate successfully. And so if the bloom times don't overlap right, then you're not going to get good pollination from your pears. So you do want to be sure that you're doing your due diligence before purchasing. Peaches and nectarines, very popular fruits that people want to grow. Do you know anyone who can put it in the chat, the difference between a peach and a nectarine? So I'll let you think about that and put it in the chat, and I'll keep talking here while you think. Peaches in general are trickier to grow here. They're more heat tolerant for sure. They're well adapted to the south, not as cold tolerant. But the biggest thing with peaches is that they're very susceptible to stress. They do not like stressful situations. They need a fair bit of fertilizer. They need regular watering. And of course, we've talked about the late spring frosts that can give us an inconsistent crop with our peaches. So if you have the right spot, if you get them established in a spot that they're happy with and that you're taking care of them well, they're going to produce well for you in the years when the weather cooperates. But if they're in a spot that they don't like, if they've got wet feet, if the soil's too heavy and not well drained, they're going to struggle a fair bit. Okay, no one bit on my peach versus nectarine. So I'm not going to leave you dangling, although it's tempting. But the difference between a peach and a nectarine is simply the fuzz on the skin. Otherwise, they are the exact same fruit, just nectarines have no fuzz on the skin and peaches do. So the other thing with peaches that is pretty counterintuitive if you've never grown fruit before is that peaches are best pruned to an open center system. So this is kind of a stylized drawing, which doesn't help us visualize it a whole lot. So I've got this picture as well to look at. And you can see that basically, as opposed to a normal, tree growth habit where we have like that central leader going up the middle, we've pruned out the central leader early on in the tree's life and have encouraged this circle of scaffolding branches. And the reason that we recommend something like this with peach trees is because peaches produce fruit on that 1-year-old wood. And they need lots of sunlight to set those fruiting buds. And so it's a completely different system. The publication I dropped into the chat is going to go into a lot more detail on that. Some peach varieties for us to take a look at. The Haven series are pretty solid middle of the road varieties that are almost always reliable. But I will also say, if you're looking for more hardy varieties, especially varieties that are more likely to tolerate late spring frosts, you might consider the lower list. The Intrepid, Reliance, Contender, Challenger, and Starfire are supposed to either bloom later or have more frost tolerance on their flowers. Now, I've had some people tell me that like Intrepid and Reliance, they're very cold tolerant, but their flavor is not very good. And so they don't love that aspect. Always trade-offs, right? Contender is the variety that I have, and I really like it. It is hardy to zone 4. It is very late blooming, and there have been years that I've had peaches that most everyone else does not have peaches because of the frost. The downside with Contender is, I think part of the reason it does so well in those frost years is that it oversets like crazy. So this year it was completely covered in blossoms, and I'm going to have to spend a significant amount of time picking off green peaches. I remember the first year, this is maybe 4 or 5 years ago, the first year I had a full crop, I picked off 5 5-gallon buckets of green peaches in order to thin it appropriately, and it still wasn't enough. Like, it still had too many peaches on it to get good fruit size. So very difficult to thin correctly, but very hardy as well. Okay, cherries. So Tart cherries are naturally a relatively small tree and relatively, they're cold hardy, they're self-fertile, productive, don't have a ton of insect and disease challenges. I think they're a good gateway fruit, especially if you like cherry pie. Like, what's not to love about that? Sometimes people really want sweet cherries, but tart cherries, I think, are a great choice for us here in Kansas. So a number of different varieties. My husband's family swears by North Star because they have the really dark red flesh. Montmorency is kind of the more traditional old school variety. And then there's some other kind of strange options in here that are, you want to research these before you jump on them. The Surefire is what I have at home, and it's kind of it's been a very well-behaved tree. It's about 5 feet tall. We get about 2 pounds of cherries off of this little well-behaved 5-foot tall tree. So definitely not going to complain about that. And then there's also some varieties that are kind of sweet tart, like they've crossed sweet varieties and tart varieties to get a little bit sweeter tart cherry. So I do know a couple people that have planted Balaton and been pleased with that. And I know there's a question from Linda in the chat as far as our bush cherries tart or sweet. And my understanding is that most bush cherry varieties are kind of the sweet tart, but a little more on the tart side than the sweet side. But always going to want to research a particular variety beforehand. So sweet cherries are an extreme challenge. Like if you want an extreme gardening challenge, sweet cherries are the place to go. They bloom very early. They need cross-pollination. The trees are large, 20 feet, even with a dwarfing rootstock. And the fruit can crack. You can have disease issues. They're picky about their location. They are not easy to grow. That said, if you're determined to try sweet cherries, there are 3 varieties that are self-fertile, so they do not need a pollinator, and have been developed for climates like ours, where there's tends to be late frosts and things like that. So if you're determined to try a sweet cherry, try one of these 3 first. Plums, we are going to, because we're per usual with me, we're running out of time. I'm going to kind of jump over plums. We've kind of mentioned there's both European and Japanese plums. European plums generally are prune plums. They're a little easier to grow than Japanese plums, which are the ones that we're more used to eating fresh. So of course, there's always a trade-off there. Okay, berries. Berries in 15 minutes. We'll get there mostly here with our berries. So in a landscape setting, berries can be shrubs or hedges. They can be kind of, like spotlight shrubs, or they can just be borders, things like that. We looked at this picture earlier where they're using the brambles and the strawberries, the raspberries and the strawberries for like a border along a driveway, which isn't a terrible idea because they tend to spread, and this kind of keeps them under control a little bit. Accent plantings. So, you can have some strawberries in containers as an accent planting. This really cool maroon foliage, that is a blueberry. So even if you never get fruit off a blueberry, which if you can get it going, you should, they can be really cool accent plants. So if you're looking at a blueberry in a container, the full color is well worth it, even if you don't get fruit right away. But still a real challenge to grow a blueberry. And then of course, with our vining plants, we don't have to have that utilitarian trellis. We can have all kinds of different arbors and trellises. I know I've seen in a number of our master gardeners' yards, they have very beautiful constructed wood arbors or trellises around their patios and things like that they put grapevines on. So lots and lots of options. And if you want something a little bit funky, this picture down in the right-hand corner with that green and pink variegated leaf, that is a Hearty Kiwi that has that bright pink color. So it's not like the fuzzy kiwi in the grocery store, it's a Hearty Kiwi. And this is in those end slides in the slide set. And it has this cool foliage. A word of warning though, Hearty Kiwi can grow 20 to 40 feet per year. They're a vine. They can take over your world if you're not careful. You also need both a male and a female kiwi plant in order to get fruit. So could be a cool option, but may not be the low maintenance option for you. And then of course, things like strawberries can be great choices as ground covers. If you're using them as a ground cover, do realize that you're probably going to sacrifice some of your fruit production because when they get thick like that, the middle of the patch is not quite as productive. Okay, so let's take a brief look at strawberries. So as we said earlier, strawberries do self-pollinate. You only need one variety. And they are one of the fruits that can be grown either as an annual or a perennial. They do require some maintenance to grow them as perennials. Just again, they get thick. So their growth habit, they're this little herbaceous plant, fairly low to the ground. But then they start putting on these runners or stolons, and they start rooting down and making these daughter plants. And so initially that's fine. Like, oh, great, more strawberries. That'll be good. But then they get to the point where they can go places you don't want them to go, and they can get the patch can get too thick, and so they're not as productive. So the other thing with strawberries from a growth habit standpoint is they produce their flowers and then their fruit in these bracts. And so, tend to have a big flower and then a couple medium-sized flowers and some smaller flowers and things like that. So they tend to produce their fruit over about a 1 to 2 week period. And they start with a small harvest of big berries until you end up with a big harvest of little tiny berries, is kind of how that habit works. So in a traditional setting or a patch type setting, we use this more matted row system where we plant the original mother plant and then we let the daughter plants grow and kind of fill in to that row or that patch or whatever the size space is. And so this sort of system is often using June-bearing strawberries. So these are traditional strawberry varieties. They generally are going to fruit in the spring to early summer. In Kansas, usually you shoot for May. Our strawberries here that are fairly protected are just kind of now starting to bloom, so definitely going to be on the later end of May this year. It usually takes about 30 days from bloom until the fruit is ready to harvest, given the weather conditions, of course. So our June-bearing strawberries are often in those perennial plantings, and you tend to get a pretty big harvest in a short period of time. There are also day-neutral varieties, and I don't have time tonight to get on my soapbox about the names that marketers give things, but you can sometimes also find what are labeled as ever-bearing strawberries. And in Kansas, there's no such thing as an ever-bearing strawberry because it gets too hot in the middle of the summer and the flowers abort. And so really you're looking at a spring crop, and if you're lucky, a fall crop, if they get through the entire season before and they're not completely fried. So you can sometimes get that fall crop. But these, if you're going to grow strawberries in a container or a small space or things like that, you would probably want to choose a day neutral or an ever-bearing variety because then you're going to get, and you've got a little more ability to choose the location, move things around, keep them cool, so on and so forth. And so you at least have the potential to get fruit more than one time a year in those containers or towers. You can find all kinds of crazy things that you can plant strawberries in. The biggest thing is making sure that you can water them adequately, especially during the summer months. So strawberries are typically planted in the early spring. And if you're using more of a traditional row or patch type system, you generally assume that about 1 foot of row is going to produce about a quart of berries if everything goes well. Okay, blackberries and raspberries. So blackberries and raspberries are both also self-fruitful or self-fertile, meaning they do not need a pollinator. And they can be a little unruly if you're not careful. There's a gentleman at the in-person class on Tuesday that inherited a thorny trailing blackberry in his yard from a previous resident, and was struggling to keep it under control and in its place. So do know that raspberries and blackberries will spread. They will spread out of their space if you are not diligent about keeping on top of the pruning. So they do generally require some trellising, definitely need lots of pruning and diligence to keep them under control. My raspberries, they will pop up, oh, a raspberry plant in the middle of the tomatoes over here or in the middle of the lawn. So, I don't stress about it. I just like, oh, you're not where you belong. I'm going to pull you up or I'm going to mow you over, and not worry about it. Blackberries They tend to grow really long canes, and they do need some summer pruning as well. I will drop the publication on raspberries and blackberries in the chat here in a minute. But anytime a blackberry cane hits the ground, it is going to root. And so you can get like this 15-foot long cane that starts growing, and then it hits the ground, 15 feet away from your original plant. And then you've got more, which maybe you'll be okay with. But again, it requires some diligence to kind of keep them under control. So don't want to deter you, but just be prepared. So our brambles, all the basic things we've already talked about with our fruit plants. So let me go ahead and grab that publication here while I'm thinking about it. Put that in the chat. And I will also drop the strawberry publication in the chat as well. Since we're here, I'm just going to do all of them at once. This next one is our grape publication, and then a couple of other things as well. Okay, back to the presentation. So with our raspberries and blackberries, and I know I've got some master gardeners on tonight, so they probably have PTSD about this part of basic training. Normally, it takes me about 20 minutes to fully explain this whole how raspberries and blackberries grow. So if you get lost, I'm not spending 30 minutes on it tonight. So if you get lost, don't feel bad. But the important thing to know about raspberries and blackberries is they're perennial plants with biennial canes. And so the first year cane that grows from the ground is the primocane. You can see here in this picture that darker green cane, and that's a first year cane. It's in its first year of growth. And then this lighter green cane is the floricane. So that is the cane that grew as a primocane, and now it's in its second year of growth. And then at the end of that second year, it's going to die, and then it'll need to be pruned out. And so that is how these plants grow. And that becomes important because different types of raspberries and blackberries are named, again, they're named different things. And so we have summer bearing raspberries and blackberries, which fruit on their second year canes. So they're putting their fruit and producing their fruit on those floricanes. So if you accidentally prune out the floricanes, you're never going to have fruit. So you don't want to do that. And typically summer bearing brambles are going to produce, actually my blackberry starts usually in May. It's a very early variety, but raspberries and blackberries can produce anywhere from May all the way through August, even into, well, summer bearing usually into August is the very end of that window. Then, again, I once again don't have time for my spiel on the catalog marketing people and their penchant for naming. But you'll see this other type, which is sometimes called everbearing, but is really more accurately called fall bearing. And so these types of raspberries and blackberries will produce fruit on their first year growth canes, their primocanes. And that production usually happens in the fall. It happens starting in August into September, and they'll keep producing fruit often until we get our first frost in the fall. So it's usually sometime in October, but I've had fall bearing raspberries still producing in December, which is pretty cool if you want to think about it, having those fall bearing raspberries, having fresh raspberries to pick in December is pretty neat. Definitely that was a late frost year for sure. And then once they go dormant, they will come out of dormancy in the spring, and those floricanes that had started producing in the fall as primocanes will finish producing, and so you'll get that spring to early summer crop as well as the fall crop. So again, there's no everbearing about it. That is something that we just kind of have to be aware of, that it really means fall and spring bearing. So lots and lots of different raspberry varieties out there, black, purple, gold, red. Unfortunately, I love gold raspberries, but they do not like Kansas. They get sun-scalded really badly. They don't like our heat. Same thing on the blackberry front. There's lots of varieties out there, thorny, thornless, upright, trailing, so on and so forth. What I will tell you is that most of us do not have the time and energy to deal with anything other than thornless, upright blackberries. Like, just buy a thornless blackberry. There is no fruit quality that is worth the thorns that are going to attack you with a thorny blackberry variety. And there's some really amazing newer thornless blackberry varieties that are really good. I will also call out, I don't normally like to promote specific, plant varieties that are like patented varieties and marketing strains and stuff like that. But these bushel and barrel varieties are kind of a marketing collection. It's, that's how they're calling them. And there are some blackberry and raspberry varieties in this line that are more compact and for containers. So we do actually have the blackberry and the raspberry in our demonstration garden. The blackberry is pretty nice, pretty productive, and the raspberry is not very productive, at least in our experience so far. So we'll kind of see how those do again this year. And then I do want to touch on grapes really briefly before we kind of wrap it up tonight. So of course, grapes, lots of landscape options with trellises and arbors, all kinds of things you can do with them. And some things to know about grapes is we've got a number of different types. So American grapes are generally what we think of as that Concord flavor or that grape juice flavor. And they're derived from American wild species. And something that a lot of folks don't realize is that that old Concord variety is not very heat tolerant. So if you want that Concord flavor, look for an improved cultivar that has more heat tolerance and is going to produce better in hot conditions. European grapes, which are a lot of the very traditional wine grapes, they are not hardy in the US. They don't tolerate our cold, they don't tolerate our heat, they don't tolerate our insects and diseases. They just don't like the US. So at least not the middle part of the US. They do okay in California, but the central part of the US, not so much. And then we have French American hybrids, which are varieties that have been crossed between European and American types. They're bred to thrive in colder climates, have resistant to some of our problematic insects and diseases and things like that. And there are also some really amazing, fairly new hybrid table grape varieties that have been developed by the University of Arkansas. And there's two different strains. There's like a planet strain. So if you're familiar with like Gustav Holst, the planets and things like that, there's like Mars and Jupiter. There's Himrod, which I always think of as Nimrod, but they call it Himrod. So we have Himrod in the demonstration garden, and it's my kids' favorite thing in our garden. They're always wanting to know when the grapes are ready because they like them that much. So some really great seedless table grape varieties that do really well here. And then the other line of University of Arkansas that's even newer are all like virtues. So like faith, hope, joy, charity, gratitude, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're looking for some newer, well-adapted table grape varieties, you might take a look at some of those. And last but not least, I promised to talk a little bit about trellising and pruning grapes. And so this diagram shows kind of what a grapevine is going to look like. It's going to have that main trunk and then these canes or cordons that grow horizontally. And when we prune them, we are actually pruning back all of the shoots that grow off of these main canes or cordons every single year. And so what we do is we want about 50% of those shoots to be pruned back so there's only 1 or 2 buds and the stalk is like 1 or 2 inches long. And that gives more vegetative growth. And then about 50%, we prune to have 3 to 5 buds. So a little bit longer stub coming off of those canes. And that is going to produce your fruit. So it's not terribly difficult. It's just really hard to cut that much off the first time that you're doing it. So that is the really quick and dirty overview of doing the grapes. So with that, if you have questions, I'm sure you have more questions than there is time to answer, but feel free to contact our Master Gardener hotline. They can hook you up with some more information and publications. I didn't get the email on the slide, so I'll go ahead and drop the email in the chat as well. So it's sgemghotline@gmail.com. So you can email our hotline if you have questions or looking for more information on anything in particular. And I will also go ahead and throw in the chat. We do have a ton of different fruit and vegetable publications. And so I'll kind of give you the overall website that lists all of these different publications out. As well. I've linked a ton of them in the chat already, but you can go direct to that main website if you would like. So I'm happy to take any questions. I did get a couple of chats asking about the handout. And so Julie might be able to answer that better, but if you registered through the library site, which I think you had to get the Zoom link, they should have, if they haven't already, they should be sending out an email with that handout attached. So you might check your junk if you haven't seen it. Like I said, Julie may have more to say on that front. And I think Shauna is asking about watching the previous Zooms if you missed them. I believe those are all on YouTube. So Julie, I don't know if you have the library YouTube link ready at hand, or it's not too terribly difficult to find.
If you go to YouTube and put in the search screen, Wichita Public Library, open it up, there's a tab for videos and all of our recorded programs are there. One thing I think I'll do is these programs have attachments that we've been sharing. I'm going to see if the area just below the video, if we can put links to these handouts for people who watch it from home. And it's not just the gardening programs, but I believe there may even be a playlist for just the gardening ones. So I want to thank everyone for being here, and I especially want to thank Rebecca for her great presentation and very informative talk about fruits, and it certainly makes me want to start growing something in my yard. Next week's program is going to be on container gardening. If you have not registered yet, we hope you'll go into the event calendar at wichitalibrary.org, and when you get to that page for the event, you'll be able to sign up. Next week is the last one in the spring series. We will be doing another series in August. So we hope you'll be looking for that and join us for it. I did put a link in the chat box that we would like for you to go to and answer some questions about your experience with the program today. It also asks you for suggestions that you have for future programs. And so thank you so much for joining us tonight, and have a good evening.